Provocateur.media.
There's a dark and ugly side to our being social animals, which is that we like to exclude and kill the weak and the injured, and that we are naturally attracted as a species to the fellow animal who portrays himself as the strong man.
The Goldwaters is brought to you by Goldwater-Adler, shaping the history of Canadian family law since 1981.
The Goldwaters vous est présenté par Goldwater-Adler, modeler l'histoire du droit familial canadien depuis 1981.
It's episode number 3 of the Goldwaters. I am your moderator, Dan Delmar, and it's my pleasure to introduce the Goldwaters to you. First, we have met Anne-France Goldwater, the senior partner of Goldwater-Adler and political commentator. How are you, Anne-France?
I am fine, thank you. How are you, Dan?
I'm excellent, thank you. We have Dr. Samantha Goldwater-Adler, a clinical psychologist. How are you, Dr. Samantha?
I'm doing great, Dan. Thanks.
Excellent. And Daniel Goldwater, an attorney based here in Montreal. Daniel, how's it going?
Going well.
Excellent. So, today's episode is all about bullying. We'll talk a little bit about political bullying, but mostly about literal bullying, and a lot about cyberbullying, which seems to be ground zero for this issue. It's being talked about a lot more in the news because we had a presidential campaign in America which featured some bullying tactics, and now the incoming First Lady of the United States wants to make this her cause. What do you think about, first, the state of bullying and the state of the bullying in public life? So, and we're seeing this now at the highest echelons of power.
First of all, when it comes to characterizing Trump's Twitter admonishments of other people in public personalities, I don't know if that's called bullying. I mean, that's just asshole behavior. That's just being hostile, and especially with his level of social status, particularly now that he's the president-elect, it's horrifying. But I don't know if it's really fair. I think it's confounding to call that bullying. When he lashes out at his critics, it's uncouth behavior. It's not consistent attacks on one person and being... help me out here, Samantha.
Well, yeah, why don't we start off with what exactly is bullying? Because it's a term that's thrown around quite a lot, and people don't necessarily have a firm appreciation of what it means. And in terms of the research definition, what is bullying? Bullying is defined as negative or aggressive acts committed frequently and over time with the intention of harming the victim. And as you were touching on before, there has to be a real or perceived imbalance of power between the victim and the perpetrator. And the negative acts, they can be physical, they can be relational, they can be verbal. It depends. And then people then, based on that, fall into 3 different groups, the bullied, the victims, and then the bully victims who have the great fortune of being on both ends of the stick. So then we get into Trump. Now, what Trump does his uncouth behavior, as you call it, does that constitute as bullying or not? I think it depends. Sometimes if he's taking shots if he's just making offensive comments about other people that are also in positions of power, and he does it as a one-off or here and there, or it's kind of a back and forth tiff, then arguably, so for example, you may say, arguably, that his behavior with Rosie O'Donnell, maybe that doesn't constitute as bullying, because they were both in positions of power at the time, and they were both dishing it out back and forth. He was far more vulgar than she, but arguably not bullying.
Well,
but
relative.
relative.
Be careful with the term position of power. What you're really saying is that the relative social status at that time was similar.
Yes. Now things are different, evidently. I would say that his behavior towards former Miss Universe, what was her name?
Alicia Machado.
I would say that would constitute pure and direct bullying. He was in a clear position of power in general, and over her in particular. He was punching down, and the things he was saying constituted relational bullying, they constituted verbal bullying, and had a real and significant effect
then
on
or
her.
now?
Both.
Both.
Both then and now.
I think that's what makes it in particular remarkably bullying. At the time, she was a minor. She was herself a child, and he was publicly shaming her. He was using his position of authority over her to diminish her, to denigrate her, to deprecate her, and in public. and she had no ability to defend herself, and it's as shameful conduct as I have seen. And in fact, for that conduct alone, I would not have voted for him for dog catcher, even if he had been the most awesome dog catcher in the world.
And then what's
but
worse,
then he continued it into...
when he was even in a greater position of power, he continued. And these things all had serious and grievous effects on her and her mental health, and the way that she was perceived and the comments that she was getting directed at her. And it was really, and in fact, and that does support, even on much lower levels when we're getting to, or less public levels, not lower levels, but less public levels when we're getting into in the schoolyard or recess or at school, bullying does have a real effect on people. Being repeatedly harassed and or assaulted by somebody who is in a position of power over you is really devastating. We are social animals. That the prospect or even the feeling of being ostracized from the group, either physically, verbally, or relationally, is frankly one of the most devastating experiences that we can have as human beings, because our survival, evolutionarily speaking, depends on being a member of the group.
Yes, but there's a dark and ugly side to our being social animals, which is that we like to exclude and kill the weak and the injured, and that we are naturally attracted as a species to the fellow animal who portrays himself as the strong man. So you take a fellow like Trump, who by nature and by pathology is a bully, period. He is a bully in any interaction that he has with anybody. Many pundits have even taken pains to comment that if we see lovely behaviors amongst a child, for instance, like Ivanka, that's a reflection on the fact that he was never very involved as a father, and you have children that were principally raised by their mothers and not by him, and escaped some of the more pernicious effects of his very aggressive personality. But the fact that he's socially perceived to be an alpha male because he's such a vicious bully, because he has such a testosterone-driven energy level that he can stay up to 3 a.m. investigating ways to attack Alicia Machado and claim that he had found some sex tape involving her, and she's disgusting and she's horrible, and who are you? You're planning to run the free world, and you don't want to apologize that you called this woman when she was a child, 16 or 17 years of age, the housekeeper, instead of just apologizing and show that you've grown up and that you're gracious. Instead, you want to attack her, and even more is the hallmark of a career bully. Which, of course, brings us to Melania Trump.
But I just think that it just needs to be unpacked, because to say, for example, when someone's abusive towards another person, most of the times it's inherently bullying. But then to say that that's an act of bullying, I think is a little glib and misunderstanding the expression. Like, is a dictator who kills his people, is he bullying his people? Yes, but we're not in the realm of bullying. We have to talk about different types of abusive behavior. When we talk about bullying,
that's where we're at with Trump. He hasn't killed anybody yet.
Samantha had nicely provided the definition. I think that guides us. But I think what we're really discussing is most of this has to do with education, young people, right? We're not talking necessarily about adults being uncouth or unkind to each other.
Yeah, you have to start with the adults. But this is our role model in chief now.
No, I appreciate that for role modeling. I'm just.
But one of the things we do talk about a lot in the context of kids, but frankly, maybe it was a couple of years ago, it was really just a term that was being bandied about frankly, between adults quite often. That any politician or any celebrity or any Tea Partier who got any negative comments put out about their platforms, what they were saying, began claiming bullying. Oh, people are just bullying me. And so it was something that's sort of been brought into more the adult world, although initially much more discussed amongst children. And I think where I find it gets tricky in terms of bullying and what is bullying and the definition of it. One is it gets tricky in terms of, and we'll get to that I think later, is how do you, is the law. So how do you legislate and how do you, criminalize, or what do you do in terms of bullying? You need to have a clear definition if you identify it as a problem, you have to say what the problem is and then how you're going to deal with it. And the other issue is just the way that we talk about it generally. If you and I, we're relatively matched in terms of power, if we say something, if you say something, a one-off mean thing to me, that's not bullying. But if it's, The question,
you can't banalize bullying
Right.
by applying it to any disagreement, no matter how heated,
This is
between.
what
then-
I was trying to draw out. This is exactly what I was trying to draw out.
Between consenting adults.
Well, it
but
doesn't, have
that's
to be, it doesn't always have to be consenting. It can also just be a mutual tiff, like two people that don't, they don't have to consent to the unpleasant exchange or to the
But they-
relationship.
but
But
you
two
see-
guys getting pissed off at each other and getting into a fist fight, that's not bullying.
But that's not bullying. But you see, that's where there's a particular change in modernity, which is up until a certain period, there was a certain mutuality of consent for two people to be in a bullying relationship. Yes, because at one point, any one person could just turn and walk away and it was done. But in a world of social media, in a world of text messages and email and Facebook and Twitter, it now is the element of consent in the bullying relationship
Get
between
consent
adults.
out. Okay.
Between adults.
Get consent out of your head, because that's not consent. By definition, is a non-consensual relationship. If it's
If a
consensual,
tiff-
then it's BDSM.
You're right. Let me turn around. If
Yeah.
there's a tiff, a dispute between adults that becomes heated and starts to escalate to a level where you start to question, have we reached a level of bullying or intimidation or a use of improper language, excessive language, improper aggression? There used to be a way where people could disengage. But there is no disengaging in the modern world because of
right.
social
It follows
media.
you when you come home and you're in your home. It's not a safe
You can't
space. You're plugged
escape.
in.
The reason we speak about bullying in schools and why it's such a problem is because a child has to go to school. At
Yes.
least until he's 15 years and 11 and a half months, a child must go to school every day. So there is no escape for a child if another child or a group of children or a teacher is bullying that child. The escape can be, and used to be in my day, a kid would change schools. And often
Yeah.
you found
And
the
now
phenomenon
kids
of
can't change schools
there's no
anymore
changing
to
schools
escape bullying
because the bullying follows the child no
Yeah, it
matter
follows
where
them
he goes.
online.
Okay, but hold
where
on.
they
We're
go.
talking about this because theoretically this is a cultural movement that's been growing. People have been talking about it more and more. And I've always looked at it. I've tried to research it, sees this a rising trend, and all the data, unless you've come across different data, suggests that if anything, bullying is declining. That
It may be-
this is not as much of an issue. It seems like this perfect media narrative. It combines everything that people love to get outraged about. You have welfare of children, and you have nasty behavior that can be really exciting to watch.
Yeah, you have the
It's-
powerful down punching to the
and
less
sensational
powerful. Yeah.
stories, sad stories like with Parsons. I mean, very sad narratives that lend themselves to some easy journalism. And I don't know if it's really indicative.
Whoa, now you're banalizing. Hey, whoa. When we're talking about these children like Rita Parsons or Amanda Todd, you're talking to children who were pushed to suicide. And I'm not trying to simplify the picture of suicide either. We all recognize there are a lot of complexities in what drives any individual at any age to suicide, and what other fragilities there can be in a child's psyche and in a child's environment. But it doesn't change the brutal fact that there was a brutal degree of bullying going on in those two children's lives, and those two children are no more. And that we have no choice. We have to. Bullying didn't used to involve a laptop or a desktop computer. Plenty of children were driven to suicide before by being beaten up by the school bully or being picked on ruthlessly by a hostile school teacher or principal. Mm-hmm. We're talking about something that has a steady thread in human history. So we haven't invented something new. It's just that now it's a lot harder for a parent to shelter and protect his child from vicious behaviors, and has become a whole other degree harder when what a child watches on television validates that horrendous behavior.
Yeah, but you're saying
keeping in mind that many kids who are bullied, not all, but many kids who are bullied themselves can engage in bullying behaviors. It's not a black and white topic we're discussing today. No.
Yeah,
Well,
but I just wanted to, but you're saying this has become far worse. I agree with you with the qualitative difference that you're identifying, that it follows you home. Point taken. But if you're then saying, therefore, there is an increased agony among people who are bullied, there's more actual bullying occurring. I mean, just the data just don't bear that out. There's less teenage suicide than ever. There's less bullying reported in these studies. So I agree that there's this shift we need to consider, but to treat it as some sort of hand-wringing social happening or zeitgeist, I think is really...
But personally, I think I put it almost in the same category, because when we get into we can get into discussions about has it decreased over the years, and there's some evidence that it may have decreased over the years. There's an argument to be made again that it's qualitative. There's certain aspects have qualitatively changed with the internet and with cyberbullying that warrant further attention and scrutiny. But the other thing is that just because something may have been decreasing a bit over the years, because there's been overall decreasing crime and violent crime throughout society over the years, or at least in Western society, it doesn't mean that for the people that are left where this is occurring, that this doesn't warrant attention. And just because maybe we had, bigger fish to fry before, or it wasn't under our lens, it doesn't mean that now it doesn't warrant significant attention. Because
so
even if it's gone down, it's still disturbingly high.
Okay,
And
that's
it's,
fine.
and it's
but
a
then, okay,
more
so-
pernicious, and if it's a more
Potentially, yeah.
pernicious problem for a smaller group of people, I'm happy there's fewer people afflicted.
I understand,
But
right.
it's
If-
harder to find the solution for the group that remain. And Melania Trump coming and taking the public spotlight, I have no idea what for. She has never wanted to be in the spotlight. She doesn't have the ability or the education to be in anybody's spotlight.
Well, but every
I mean, yes,
first lady has to have a now, or
this- 'cause
Margie
you
has
have
to have a
to look,
cause.
like, again,
it's
Mom,
always
this-
a woman's topic.
Yeah, that's my point.
It's
This
always
bullying
gotta be a
issue, but
woman's
this whole
topic.
bullying issue is
doesn't-
for the Oprah set. Let's just be honest. There's nothing in it that is particularly devastating. We've all agreed that the actual prevalence of it, if anything, suggests
Wow,
that
spoken by somebody who has no children.
no, because here's the issue. If you're talking about how to address these issues, you want to talk about policy proposals. Let's go to those issues. Okay, I think.
But we're not there yet.
Well, we
We're
just
talking,
we were segueing into that. We were just
No,
saying
we were
that-
talking about somebody taking the bully pulpit because nobody would pay any attention to anything Melania would have to say other than her choice of makeup, were it not for the
her
fact that
bows.
she's and her bows. Yes, we won't say why her bows, but something else, or her choice in plastic surgeon. Get a new one.
Oy.
But other than that, she seems to have taken the bully pulpit because she's married to the bully in the pulpit, and promotes and suggests and promotes a very positive message written by somebody else, clearly not her words, about how it's important to communicate to children that they should not bully each other, which is a noble message, and a lot more could be said, and we're going to be the people saying more about it today. But I would say to Melania, and I'm surprised more didn't say it, your anti-bullying campaign should begin at home. Get a protective order in favor of your son, who is at a critical age. A 10-year-old prepubescent boy is at a critical age, because we know that boys bully, girls bully, boys can be victims of bullying, they can be the aggressors. But when puberty hits, he is more likely at that time to be infected by Western society's affection for bullying behavior. We know 26.5% of Americans voted to put a bully into the White House, and he needs to be protected from the aggression of his father. And if Melania were serious about it, that's what she would do. She would say there is a no bullying policy in my home. Look, she's not going to be living in the White House anyway. We know she's going to continue to live in New York. Frankly, I don't think Trump's going to live in the White House. He doesn't like the quality of the help. He's going to live somewhere else. And
Not enough busts of him and paintings of him in the White House.
Clearly it would need to be redecorated, and he's not going to pay for it. I don't think he can afford it.
So what would you do to solve this problem that you've identified?
What would I do? I thought about it.
Yeah, think about it.
I thought something that would be very good to do, in my opinion, would be to steer away from drawing attention to the negative behavior, because for some reason drawing attention to negative behavior makes it more attractive to a lot of children. I would talk about the responsibility of being a good net citizen, a good netizen. I would talk about how much good is accomplished by the communications that we can have on the internet, and get children engaged young. Because, for instance, there's age limits to be on social media that no kids respect or follow. Kids get on and lie, and their parents don't supervise them. I think part of the problem with cyberbullying is because all of us as parents were ingrained with this notion, do you know where your child is? Do you know where your child is? When I was a young parent, that was the social message. And as long as your child was at home, your child was safe. And you'll remember, I'm sure you will, kids, that I always had a big thing about bring over as many friends as you like to the house, because as long as you're home with your friends, I know you're safe. Whereas in today's world, that's exactly where you're not safe. Because instead of being out at the rink skating, or instead of being at McDonald's eating junk food, everybody's in fact in front of his or her own laptop or desktop computer in a locked room, getting onto sites that nobody should be on, not even adults.
No, but look, whether they're on, but that now we're getting, if we're getting to
learning from the trolls.
Look, but when we're getting into sites that nobody should be on, that's when you can get into, issues about what sort of pornography people are consuming and what sort of violent media they're consuming. But when you're getting to, it's not as simple. I like your approach of focusing on a more pro-social message, like let's encourage the positive rather than merely focusing on the negative and discouraging the negative. But frankly, those things aren't entirely effective. What's found to be most effective, at least in terms of school-age youth, is really viewing the problem as a systemic, multi-level issue and addressing it as a systemic, multi-level issue.
So talking about problem solving, there are a lot of jurisdictions all across North America that are passing various bullying laws. Do you think that's one way to get a handle on this problem? And what would a bullying law look like?
I think that's part of where it ends up getting really tricky, because there's certain arguments, and I'm going to make a comment here, and I'm going to defer to the two lawyers in the family to address this. But it's really, my impression is that there's already a lot of laws that can capture bullying behavior to begin with. Some criminal laws, some tort laws that may not be being applied in this case, but should be applied. In cases where they're not being appropriately applied, sometimes strange laws end up being applied, like teenagers being accused for spreading a selfie of their topless girlfriend, or being charged with child pornography, even though they're all teenagers. And so that ends up being, frankly, rather bizarre and seeming inappropriate, because that's not the original purpose of the law. But otherwise, the issue is, when you're getting into legal remedies, it's more than just a legal issue. And even if you do get laws out there, one of the things I have the most difficulty with in terms of the bullying definition is, and I'm curious what you guys have to think about this. If you have somebody, so let's say there isn't a power imbalance between us. Like you have a group of kids and they're all about the same age and they're all relatively the same social standing. And then a group of them decide to start sending hateful tweets to one of their classmates. So individually, no single one of them has a real or perceived power imbalance, a power over the victim. But in numbers, there certainly is that power. So then if you're going to, and this happens with adults all the time, and on Twitter, on Facebook, having like a group of people sort of mobilizing to send these really hateful messages, how do you prosecute that? Because then if any one person in the class then sends it, can you prove intent? Can you prove that they're subject to this bullying law?
Sure,
they can just be the one schmuck who's sending the one hateful comment, whereas the issue is the aggregate, is the group.
Well, let's try to deconstruct all of this. First of all, the criminal law, as we should know, if we don't already know it, is quite a blunt instrument for social policy, and not necessarily very effective.
Especially when you're targeting youth and teenagers. Do you want to criminalize kids?
Well, therein is the problem as I see it. We're talking generally about teenagers after all. The adolescent brain is not fully formed. Many children who have been involved in serious incidents of bullying, when interviewed after, realized and admitted they did not consider the consequences of their words, how serious the consequences could be. And I point out, in fact, it's one of the reasons in my office I try, to my dismay, to stop all the young lawyers who are 25 to 35 years of age. I will try to stop them from texting and emailing, because when you text or email a colleague or a client, you don't think and reflect as much as when you take the time to compose a letter and have to set down a letter and correct it, print it, sign it, and send it out.
Well,
so I think that the spontaneity of social media is part of what contributes to children with their already immature brains from acting too impulsively, and perhaps without enough of the malice of forethought to satisfy the standard of the criminal law to obtain a conviction.
And as a side note, just to add to what you're saying, because you're saying that there's a lot of these things online can end up being quite impulsive, and so it becomes very difficult to fully consider what they're doing. The other issue with cyberbullying, for example, relative to in person, is that you don't see the person's reaction. And that makes a big difference as a kid, as you're growing, particularly as a kid, and as you're growing up and as you're learning what's appropriate, what's inappropriate, and you're kind of, feeling it out, is that if I say something hurtful to my friend or to someone in my class and I say it directly to them, then I have to look at their faces and look at the devastation that they're experiencing, or I have to watch them cry. And that's painful to see. Whereas online, I don't get that experience at all. I can just send this stuff out, and then I have no idea how they're reacting afterwards, and I can just giggle to myself and whatever.
Well, that's where, that's why when I thought about this prior to this podcast, I thought we have to think more about what it is in educating our children to be responsible netizens from the get-go. And these are the exercises in school are important, empathy-building exercises that will require children to face those consequences and to learn to anticipate the consequences of the hateful words on the net. As Carol Todd, the mother of Amanda Todd, who committed suicide as a cyber abuse victim at the ripe old age of 15, she said, well, what do you tell a person who's been told to hang herself and that the rope will be provided? We're not talking banal insults between kids, but words that are that hateful.
Yeah, but last I checked, incitation to commit suicide is already a crime.
That's why I think that we already have a framework in the
I was
law
waiting
that
this whole time just for you to say that the legal framework does not need to change. Right? Is that your conclusion? That's all I was waiting. I started by saying
you don't like the foreplay,
there's no
Daniel?
serious evidence that this is a real problem that is growing in any intensity. In fact, it's been decreasing. That's number one. So the diagnosis of the problem, I think, is problem number one. And now we come to the problem, the next part of the discussion, policy-wise, nothing to do. So this is why I think this is a fluff discussion.
A fluff discussion. So go home.
No, I'm just pointing out. I find that the seriousness with which cyberbullying is approached sometimes, I find a little outrageous. Again, there's a reason why Melania Trump, again, we're talking about, and it's a sad thing that first ladies always have to take on these very fuzzy issues that everyone can agree with and is happy about, doesn't necessarily demonstrate anything that's a pressing policy concern. I think there's a reason it's part of that realm of discussion. I don't see that there's data on this. It's actually the least prevalent type of bullying is internet bullying. Most bullying occurs face-to-face in schools, and there's no evidence it's been increasing.
And it's only in the last few years, in fact, that this bullying, that the traditional bullying that takes place face-to-face has been taken seriously in schools, nor have schools realized the extent to which a child who's a bully often becomes a bully from having been bullied himself. So there's a relativity and a fluidity.
Most bullying incidents are still committed by the quote-unquote pure bullies. But yes, there's a significant subgroup that that give it and receive it.
Right.
Yes.
So it requires a certain delicacy and a certain immediacy in the interaction. Now, the framework of the criminal law is there because incitement to suicide is illegal, although I reported that to the bar of Quebec, where a young lawyer incited a neighbor of ours to commit suicide, a young woman, and the bar did nothing about it. So I don't know to what extent there's still a lot of willingness to react when somebody engages in such horrendous bullying. But in addition, you got to remember that our rules on criminal harassment, which are great, which are robust, have had to evolve over the years to cover stalking, physical, regular stalking, the stalking we know about it. So existing laws may be there, but have already had to be fine-tuned to adapt to newer and crueler ways that people behave. And in the same vein, I think that existing framework of laws, without being rewritten, may need also be adapted to capture some of these other behaviors as well. As Samantha points out, when there's a group of people, and I think the criminal law has its tools because there is a concept of a conspiracy to commit an offense. There are plenty of offenses that are committed by people in groups. And I don't think we can just be passive and say that our existing laws cover the ground. But what I think we need to do is be a little more assertive about how we're going to capture and control this problem outside the framework of the criminal law. And as for your example, I want to come back to the child porn example, yours, Samantha, this notion that children, and they do, take pictures of themselves or of each other that are pornographic in nature because they're teenagers and they're going to do that. And in my day, thank God, those Polaroids don't surface again 20, 30, and 40 years later. Now you know why I never pursued a political career. Whew. But in today's world, those digital images, that wasn't a joke, by the way. But in today's world, you know your mother well enough, that's why you didn't laugh.
Right.
Good woman.
Yep.
But in today's world, those images are immediately saved on a computer. They're there, they're in a JPEG, a TIFF, and they can be disseminated rapidly. And there I have to lean in favor of using the blunt instrument of the criminal law, because the harm, notably to a woman, and this is a sex-mediated difference, so men with fragile egos, stop listening right now. But when it comes to the harm that can be done to a young woman when a portion of her body is disseminated on the net, is horrendous. It can destroy her life.
Yes, but now we're talking about specifically
and
sort of nude selfies, and in terms of the harm caused to people by being, in general, people by being bullies, there's not really much evidence of a difference, a sex difference going on there. But especially when you're getting
there are boys
if you're talking
who have
about
suicide,
if you're talking
girls
about
who
the
have
digital
committed
breadcrumbs, so the proof of any bullying that stays on the internet, whether it has to be revenge porn or whether it's on your social media page. I mean, this is something that you should be interested in. The right to be forgotten is a legal doctrine that's been applied in a lot of European jurisdictions to exactly with the blunt instrument of the law to find ways to delete defamatory statements online that have...
I don't think that's what it is. That right to be forgotten, and I wish I knew more about it, a doctrine that's developed in Western Europe, is where all trace of your identity is completely eliminated from the internet. Everything.
Is it that?
Yes. And when I was reading about it, as it was developing, it kind of beggared the imagination, because we live in a hugely interconnected world. I don't even understand, even if I were to exercise that today and say, eliminate my entire history of everything, every time my name has ever appeared on the internet, how you would do it in today's world, I'm not exactly sure, but how you would not then reappear 10 minutes later, I don't understand either. I think it's something that the cemetery of the great nations of Western Europe came up with, but that could only really apply to cadavers.
Here's a question for Dr. Samantha, because even if we all agree that legislatively maybe it's a tough one to crack, on social media you have this low-level bullying and this low-level aggressivity which follows people throughout their lives. How do you attack that problem even if it doesn't get that serious? Does this low-level social media bullying affect the way that people become adults and young professionals?
I think it does. It certainly does have an effect, and it seems, and if we even think of our own experiences, where we try to put ourselves in the shoes of anyone else, then it's almost evident. A lot of the things that we expect kids and teenagers to just put up with as part of growing up are things that we would never put up with ourselves as grown-ups. If we had a work web page or a work Facebook group, and our colleagues were giving us, quote, low-level taunts, whatever it was, about what we look like, about how we arrive, about our work, we would be deeply disturbed, and that would be, we consider that a hostile work environment, to consider leaving work, or consider talking to HR departments. And these things do have, effects on our mental health as things go on, as life continues. And sometimes, again, it's one thing if we have, one thing that shows up in our feed that may be a bit negative. It's another thing if it's a lot of things that are showing up, or a lot of different people that are making these types of comments. It can really compound the effect. Now, the question is, well, what do you do about it? And that's a tough one, because there's what you do about it on an individual level, like if it's if it's your kid that's being subject to this, and there's what you do about it at a school level or a more systemic level. Are you dealing with stopping it, or are you dealing with prevention? There are some interventions that have been put in place preventatively. Oluis is a researcher who's really pioneered a lot of the approaches in that area. And in effect, the approaches that are most effective in terms of, in big numbers, are really when they're systemic, when you're dealing with addressing it on a classroom curriculum level, having included there, in terms of school policy, in terms of punishments through the schools, in terms of peer support.
How about in terms of parental involvement?
In terms of parental involvement as well. But the thing is that each individual approach, even if you look at social skills, you think that social skills would be helpful. Those things aren't really helpful. It has to be, bullying comes at a bunch of different levels, and so it needs to be addressed on a bunch of different levels. And parent involvement is always great, but it's not sufficient.
Well, no one thing is sufficient, but if I look at it's easy for us as adults to say that, and that's, I think, your position, Daniel, is that when you look at the big numbers, you see kids aren't faring that badly because the rates of teenage pregnancy are down, binge drinking, drunken driving, violent crime amongst juveniles.
Whoa. To what extent those are all related to bullying is a separate question.
But they're indicating that in general children are faring better and are being raised more attentively. However, when you look at what children self-report, I think this is important, that 71% of students report incidents of bullying that they perceive to be a problem at their school. 1 in 10 students drop out of school because of repeated bullying. And that in terms of reporting about teachers, 2/3 of students believe that their schools respond poorly to bullying, and a similarly high percentage believe adult help is infrequent and ineffective. So the children themselves, in the millions, they estimate 3.2 million students are victims of bullying every year. Now, keeping in mind there's a range of behaviors, we're not talking necessarily a number that all lead to a catastrophic outcome, but we are talking about a huge number of children who are not having a satisfying and excellent school life as a result. And if children are speaking out and saying they don't feel adequately supported and protected, well, then we're failing as parents, as educators, to get in and intervene and educate children the way we do. When we educate them, we're able to tell kids who to pick up a soccer ball to understand, okay, here are the rules in this game. There are some rules. You hit with your foot, you hit with your head, can't take it with your hands. And we communicate these rules, and kids are able to translate these rules no matter what team they're on and what schools they go to.
I hate to be academic with you. You said 70%? Is that the quote that you had?
71%.
Well,
there's a difference between saying that they're reporting that it's a problem versus saying that they are subject to it.
They didn't say they are, but that they perceive in their school bullying is a problem, right? Mm-hmm. And then although both boys and girls are just as likely to be the objects of vicious bullying by their peers, what's even more disturbing, what's particularly disturbing, is that boys get older, they are less and less likely to feel sympathy for the victims of the bullying and are more likely then to contribute to the problem than solve it. Because, of course, that's part of, as boys get older, their socialization to be tough, to be stoic, and to take it.
Well, on this point, I will say something constructive. There's
for a change, yay.
Philip Zimbardo, right, of the Stanford Prison Experiment fame. His project that he's been on for a number of years now has been all about this. It's called the Heroic Imagination Project. He has a TED Talk about it, which is fun to watch. Essentially, it's about how to induce compassion in young people and how to turn it into action. He has as the model people who have gone out and rescued someone from train tracks, and you ask that person why did they do that, and they said, well, it just felt right, and that's what my role model would have done. And the idea of role modeling, there's a whole program for this. He's partnered with the APA and many schools across America to try to inculcate this in the curriculum, which is all good. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that. I was just talking, the only thing that I'm being kind of a brat about is the prevalence of this problem and the extent to which it can really be controlled through legislation or through other policy proposals. More awareness is great.
I think it's one piece. I think that legislation is one piece. It's one piece of a much broader issue. And if you're going to get into house,
if we're going to have an opinion about it, I thought we just had my former maître de stage weigh in and said that she doesn't think that anything needs to really change.
I said the rules on harassment probably need to evolve. We don't want to make a mistake like Nova Scotia did, which adopted its own Cyber Safety Act and which was then overturned by the provincial Supreme Court as unconstitutional under the Charter because the definition of cyberbullying was just too broad. So I think incremental change would help, but I don't think you change society. In the same way that the criminal code in and of itself has zero preventative effect, maybe dissuasive effect, but not preventative. I would much rather we focus more, like particularly in Quebec, where we have a huge problem of dropouts of young men in high schools. We have a terrible high school success rate for boys. And a lot of those boys, if they don't succeed at school, whether they've been bullied or have had other difficulties, can go on to become criminals because other doors to respectable life are not open to them. So I'd rather we put our social resources to getting into high schools, or what the Americans in fact would call middle school, which really should be intervening from about grade 6 on, to promote empathy, which would
I think the other thing
prevent
that's
a lot of bullying, and to teach computer skills while at the same time teaching responsibility in the exercise of those computer skills.
And I think empathy and compassion, I think, are extremely important all the way throughout. But there's the other aspect too, which is bystanders, which is social responsibility, is being able to have, and that applies across the lifespan. I think it's really important. It's not enough to just target preventing the bullies themselves by saying, you need to have empathy. It's important, it's a component, but it's also, what about the people that witness these things? And they need to have the sense of empowerment and the sense of obligation, that this is your civic obligation, this is your obligation as a person, as a human, to step in if you see something wrong being done against someone else, rather than, frankly, our natural inclination, which tends to be to, be quiet lest we draw the bully's ire, or to, join in because, hey, maybe it's funny and it's nice to be on that side rather than the other side.
Well, I've seen more of that behavior on the adult end when I observe or participate in certain Facebook and Twitter wars. I've seen more people being willing to step up and comment when somebody in the engagement becomes aggressive. But that's a behavior amongst adults.
Yes.
Where there's a certain self-correcting socialization that's developing in social media.
Right.
But I don't think it would be utopian to believe that's trickled down to how children behave. I think most children would be afraid to answer if a bully starts engaging in a negative discourse.
But
on
that
social
it could be
media.
it could be their obligation to go tell somebody, to jump in, to discourage others from joining in. There's still ways that you can encourage bystanders to speak up and to really have a role, because it can't just be only targeting the bullies and the victims. And part of the issue that ends up coming up, for example, in my practice, so if I have a client who's coming in and, they're being bullied at school, part of what makes it really challenging is that, a lot of times when we're dealing with this, we're dealing directly with the victim of the bullying. And so it becomes, well, what do you say to the victim when it's not their fault? And in the end, it ends up being, well, there's not much I need to deal with on your end other than, mental health support and just, ignore, stay in a safe place. But is really trying to deal with the adults and try to deal with the kids that are targeting them, because nobody should have to.
What is your advice?
What is my advice?
How can you encourage somebody to develop the resilience to inoculate himself or herself against the perniciousness of the attacks of
my main target is stopping the bullying from happening to begin with. I think, to me, it seems it's on its face absurd to tell someone that you just need to cope better with aggression, verbal or physical or relational aggression that's being done to you. It blows my mind even as a concept. What I will tell them as I work with them is we'll work on self-esteem building, we'll work on ignoring the bullies, we'll work on trying to stick to the people, to stay in, again, to be in safe places, like stay near the teacher, stay near your friends, talk to people when this happens, and how that it's more the bully's problem and not their problem. Essentially, in terms of it doesn't have to reflect on who you are, it reflects on who the other person is.
Well, can't I take the role of Daniel in this conversation and say, well, what's wrong to say to a kid, listen, toughen up. You're going to be an adult one day. You're going to
an adult would call the police.
No,
I never said that, just to be clear. I never said tell a kid who's being bullied and who's coming home crying and maybe bloodied, toughen up. That wasn't what I was saying, but go on.
Well,
this is one thing also I find funny about this bullying discussion is that it bleeds into so many other cultural happenings in the zeitgeist that people love to talk about it because it speaks to internet culture and the coarsening of the culture in general. People love to talk about that, declinist type of arguments. I also think it leads into the counter critique from the right, which is snowflake culture, right? It's like, oh, we're all just complete oversensitive and we have to have more and more rules to debate and no one can ever say what they really mean or engage in vigorous exchange of ideas lest they be called a bully or a bigot. I mean, this is why this issue I find is so amorphous. It touches on so many things, gets everyone very excited. But when it comes to bullying, you could be accused of being a bully. Like, if you ever listen to, in British parliamentary debates and how aggressive and devastating they can be, and this is in public forums and all their colleagues. I mean, as attorneys, we know that sometimes when you go out into a courtroom also, there's no holds barred, and you never want to disparage your colleague or treat them with respect, but it's a contest of ideas. It's a contest of rhetoric.
Well, but that is one of the rules that we have in terms of communications between attorneys, and it's something I'm careful, like when I correct correspondence that junior lawyers engage in, I always tell them, be very, very careful with the use of the word you. When you're writing a letter and you're talking about bad behavior, you're writing to a colleague, you're not writing to the adverse party. So if you write to your colleague, you colleague are being mean-spirited or improper, inappropriate, blah, 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 there can be a context in which that could be viewed as bullying behavior,
It still wouldn't be bullying if it's amongst colleagues.
Because there isn't a power imbalance. But I still want to address where Daniel is talking about the use of bullying to cover a broader range of behaviors. I think it's always careful. I think lawyers make an effort to distinguish the communications between them as attorneys and the behavior of the clients. You can say, your client's behavior is inappropriate, not you are inappropriate. So there's that nuance. But it also comes back to Samantha's point, which is we mustn't dilute what bullying really means, and that bullying, by definition, only takes place when there's an imbalance in power or social status in the hierarchy. Mm-hmm. At the end of the day, if your best friend calls you a bum outside of school, forget it. You're walking down the street. You're not in the same school at all. Well, he's not your best friend anymore. End of story. Because he's in the same social status as you.
There's limits to the power imbalance perspective, though, if you want to take it outside.
Well, it also needs to be repeated over time.
No, I understand, but even that one alone, I mean, sometimes it leads to absurdities where, there's a discussion about political correctness, like whether or not, a black person can be anti-white racist, right? The idea is just that, of historical power imbalance, right? We know that it's white supremacy that oppressed blacks throughout most of Western history, and so to be anti-white is to express an anti-white opinion as a black person has to be defended in some sense. Not the same thing as racism. This is a serious debate that goes on the left. I mean, I'm not making this up, and so it leads to this.
Well, sure, it's very hard to say the oppressed minority group is suddenly becoming the oppressor. Yeah, that sure would be way too easy.
Well, yes, and I've heard these strange definitions actually in terms of racism, to touch on what you're saying, where it's, technically the definition is discriminating against someone on the basis of race. But again, it does seem kind of absurd, and some people have tried to add an extra definition or extra layer to the definition in keeping with bullying, that it's, you have to be in a position of power.
But this is where you get you get into very tricky terrain here, because then you start getting into identity politics necessarily, and collective trauma. These ideas that have been very popular in the past number of years. As if me speaking Daniel Goldwater today as a Jew, when I interact with other people, I have to be concerned about like if someone is going to say something that concerns me as a Jew and offends my heritage, that all of a sudden the argument should be thrown out. Or again,
but it's a different issue, because if you're at your workplace, for example, or you're applying for some sort of permit, and then the person who's giving it to you, or if you're talking to a judge and the judge says, like, I don't know, something, stop trying to Jew me down, then that's different than a colleague or a buddy or like some schmuck on the street who comes over and says, like, hey, stop being such a Jew about it. It's still offensive on both levels, but one has a much greater potential effect on you because of that power imbalance.
Right.
Yes, for instance, but you're ascribing power imbalances to racial groups. That's what we were discussing. We're talking about races.
Well, are we getting into a racist group?
Cast as the victim. That is necessary in that discussion. You have to cast one race as a victim of history, and that's a very dangerous place to go.
But we're in the world, when we're in the world of bullying, we're in the ultimate world of what we lawyers like to call ad hominem or ad feminem attacks. It means attack that is personalized to the individual without regard. Isn't that awesome about bullying? Bullying in its own way is the antithesis of racism, because you're not attacking the person for any particular reason but that he consumes oxygen. You don't like him, and you're going to say anything and do anything to denigrate, deprecate, destroy, ruin, trash the reputation of, and otherwise hurt and cause harm to that person with malice aforethought. Wait, I think I just defined a new criminal act. I think I just got it right there. The whole point of it, the whole point of bullying is how targeted it is, right?
Well, it's targeted, but it can still overlap with a whole bunch of other things.
Because people are very creative, yes.
And generally the people that tend to be most likely, not necessarily, but most likely to be targets of bullying are the ones who have social communication problems, who are otherwise isolated, who don't have as many friends, and for boys, the ones that are physically small. So it's essentially the ones that, for lack of a better word, are easy targets, are the ones that tend to get preyed on the most. And what gets even more complicated when you're going to start to get into, policy or preventative efforts, or what do, is the bully victims. Because what do you do about those guys? So you have the kid who, let's say, is being bullied by a group of other kids, and then is, punching down to, for whatever reasons, is punching down to other kids in the group. And then...
Because that's what he's learned. See, what we want to prevent is this negative socialization that creates Donald Trumps 70 years down the road. That's what you want to prevent.
Well, and that gets to be the other issue, which is in terms of reality television, and in terms of, I guess, just reality, is that what do you do about children? A lot of people are really quite concerned with Donald Trump being the president-elect. What do you do about, now we have a model of bullying, of, and depending on people view it, of racism, of misogyny, and, think of the children. Now, how are you supposed to give your children a message that this is wrong when, one of the people that's supposed to be held in the greatest esteem in the country, or potentially the free world, is engaging in these behaviors? So yes, I think socialization is extremely important, but it gets very difficult because especially as kids get older, when kids are little, mommy and daddy are really important in terms of the social message communicated to them. But as they get into adolescence, peers and society kind of take the helm, they take over. So what do you do when they're watching, your favorite there, when they're watching Kitchen Nightmares, when they're watching Gordon Ramsay, when your favorite there?
I was so glad you came to Gordon Ramsay.
Or Judge Judy.
Or Judge Judy. Yeah, my goodness, Judge Judy.
No,
Oy.
Judge Judy, forget. There is no justification in the world. There is nothing.
But even if you think about it, you think that...
I got to get this one off my chest. That justifies a woman who was an attorney, a jurist. She practiced in family law. She became a lawyer in family court and sat for 25 years. She knows very well that people who might have been firing on all cylinders in many spheres of their lives when going through family breakdown of any kind, a difficult child, your child's under the aegis of youth protection, a divorce, another type of breakdown, are so particularly vulnerable. And that's the populace that she had to deal with her entire professional life. And for her then to come on and act as the equivalent of a small claims court judge in arbitrating these hearings is also dealing with people, perhaps not in as dramatic a mess as people going through divorce, for instance, but who are nonetheless usually from lower socioeconomic strata. And that's why they're there. And she belittles them, she denigrates them, and there is no excuse. Unless somebody manifests active bad behavior before her during a hearing, vis-a-vis the other litigant, there is no reason to denigrate and deprecate or in otherwise correct or chastise the people who are involved. Mm-hmm. So her behavior is
well, but then you also have the Simon Cowells, you have the Gordon Ramsays.
Gordon Ramsay is the one that interests me the most.
Well, a lot of people love Gordon Ramsay, but he's a real D, that guy.
He's the most, to me, the most interesting character of the lot. Because again, with Simon Cowell, he may justify his behavior by saying he does a public service to people who think they can sing by telling them, you cannot, go away, do something else in your life. But he has done it on many occasions. Right, but he doesn't
exactly say it in that way.
And people loved it. You had, how many years was American Idol on the air thanks to him and his bullying behavior?
Well, actually, in the last few years of American Idol, they really tried to make a concerted shift towards a lot of that just targeting of just blatant bullying of people on their program. It used to be a really, really big focus, which was deeply disturbing, where they would make a big part of the show was just watching people who have difficulty singing or who have other, clearly have some disabilities, some of them, some cognitive disabilities or some developmental disabilities, and just mocking them mercilessly.
I think that
and over the past several years, it started to change, and the focus was much more on presenting only talent, only people that were, cross the threshold or were at the threshold.
Well, and that was very much an import from British culture and appears to be something that continues to entertain our forefathers as Canadians, right? Because we're supposed to be the mix of the Brits and the French. And that still seems to be part of British culture, the types of shows that mock people cruelly, including people with mental health issues, and I think it's horrendous.
I don't know, people treat this like it's a new thing. What was the Gong Show when you were a kid? Wasn't that around?
It doesn't have to be a new thing.
Where they would strike a gong when people would have these talent acts that
I think it's
south?
irrelevant. I think, frankly, it's irrelevant whether it's a new thing or whether it's increasing. It doesn't matter.
Thing.
It's going on. It sucks. It's still glorified.
But
whether it's still more or less.
Hold on. I just want to make a point here.
But come to somebody who's
well, talk about Gordon Ramsay. You're talking about Simon Cowell. You talk about these people. I think people can also distinguish between entertainment and reality. I think that there's always going to be a market.
Why is that entertaining?
It's a show.
How the hell could that be entertaining?
Well, it's sensational. You have people being embarrassed. What do you want? I mean, celebrity culture. I mean, people like to watch other people suffer or to be in embarrassing situations.
I told you.
And should that be
There's a dark side to man as the social animal, and that's that dark side.
No,
and that's
I think people like
a critter like Trump to rise to the top like shit.
But Trump
to the
is
top
different
of a
because
toilet.
Trump is running for office. Simon Cowell's not running for office. These are TV shows. They're entertainment properties.
He wasn't
That's
running
what they
for
are.
office when he was assuming exactly that.
But when you're saying things are
when
entertainment,
he had his reality show, he had a different mandate. He had to be sensational for the sake of a reality show.
No, he had to assume be a figure like Simon Cowell or like Gordon Ramsay, and that's what made him popular with those hillbillies.
Well,
college educated, though some may be.
Well, let's get out of the hillbilly talk. But anyways, when you're getting into, it seems frankly naive to think that seeing things on television or in any sort of media has no effect on us. It seems absurd on its face.
No,
because even if you
fine,
just
but you just admitted that right now there's much more of a focus on American Idol for actual talent. The vulgarity it was more of a 90s, early aughts thing, the rise of reality television that was particularly vulgar. We're kind of past that cultural meme, I like to think.
One would hope. I don't think that we're really past it. I think that there still is, and and I hate to say it and bring it back to this schmuck again, is that the biggest example is Trump and his popularity. And I think frankly that a lot of reality TV kind of normalizes this behavior. So even if we see it as it's just entertainment and we can tell the difference, you watch something enough times and it starts to become normal. It starts to become acceptable. You start to be desensitized to it. So you see it, you hear it, you go, okay, no big deal. Maybe the first time it gives you the rush and the thrills and you say, ooh, that's so naughty. But after a while it just becomes, Tuesday. It's just not a big deal anymore. And there isn't, reality TV hasn't been around quite long enough to have a big body of research in terms of what the effects are. There's some evidence that at least, based on survey data, that it does affect how people start to view interactions more maliciously or more negatively, and they start to see things they start to interpret social interactions as more threatening, the more reality TV they watch. But otherwise, there is still a big body of research in terms of consuming, violent and aggressive media. And that at least in the short term, it does pump you up and really prime you for that stuff.
And that brings us to Gordon Ramsay. Because I was curious to know, it's not that hard for us to have a certain degree of consensus.
Now, let's just stop. Let me just intro this.
Yes.
Gordon Ramsay is mommy's celebrity crush. She really loves Gordon Ramsay. She watches him. She gets all flushed and excited to see him on television and thinks that he's such a good guy with such a warm heart. And she's told me with eyes watering and her hand on my shoulder what a warm heart Gordon Ramsay has. Now go, Gordon Ramsay.
You just ruined my whole presentation. That's
and
it.
Now if he's
I'm
listening,
Trump.
Now if he's listening, he knows that you have a crush on him. Yeah. So.
God, did that sound diabolical? Okay. Let's go back to Gordon Ramsay. What had charmed me about him was not his role in Hell's Kitchen, but Kitchen Nightmares. because I was always stricken by how sympathetic he was to, notably, the women. The women who owned and operated the restaurants, or the women who were terrified because their husbands were blowing up the equity in the house and the college fund. And he had like such a genuine concern and empathy for them, and never spoke improperly to a woman, right? And I was also impressed that a lot of the work that he did on those shows struck me as more real in terms of teaching these are real businesses after all, teaching them team building exercises. Also teaching them to get out into their communities and meet the people in their towns to, build a drum up business for the restaurant. So I felt he was teaching real skills and had a real concern for people. But of course, that was not the part that made him the most popular. The things that I found attractive and where the empathy struck me as meaningful. And he became popular, of course, with Hell's Kitchen on American television. And in Hell's Kitchen, of course, well, he's like Trump, apprentice.
So wait, so you like and accept Gordon Ramsay despite his verbal aggression and his bullying. To you, that's just not important enough to affect how you view him.
I'm getting there.
Okay.
You're preempting me.
Okay.
By thinking that you're cleverer than I by half. And you are, because you're my offspring. It's natural. The genes improve as they are propagated. But when we come to Hell's Kitchen, and which interested me, like all kitchen and cooking shows do, we live in a very interesting era where people cook less than they've ever cooked before, and yet are more fascinated than they've ever
by
been
watching people
by
cook.
watching other people cook. And
Yeah.
it's like the most popular television. You start a cooking show, you have an instant success, and people are sitting at home eating fast food. I don't get it. But be that as it may, obviously his reputation on the British show Kitchen Nightmares is what interested me. And then I started watching Hell Kitchen, was absolutely mortified and stricken. But what I was trying to figure out in this show, which is different from what Simon does, is here he stays engaged with these candidates, these contestants, for the entire duration of the season, right? The idea is to choose someone who's going to have a real prize, cash, and a job. And a serious and interesting job, and of course a lot of publicity and public exposure. So he's not just gratuitously disrespecting somebody for ratings.
Yeah, but
No, he's
Hold
doing it.
on.
He's doing it in a context where it's much harder for them to actually escape.
And if you were sympathetic to the policies that Trump proposes, which I'm not, I don't think you are, you should be, but then maybe you would have a similar opinion about him. You'd say, I'm sympathetic to what he's doing. Like you're saying for Gordon Ramsay, here's an ambitious guy who has a real devotion to his craft and wants to spread it around, and the ideas supporting his craft are good. So therefore, you dismiss what can be seen as bullying behavior.
It is bullying. Like
Okay,
it's brought
But
a pretty
hang
basic
on,
level.
but I'm not there. I haven't excused his behavior yet. I was just trying to understand where are the distinctions between his behavior and behavior like Simon Cowell's or Judge Judy's that are just reprehensible, and I see no.
Simon
Well,
Cowell doesn't
I'll
give
give
it
you
as
the
much-
answer. There is no distinction. There's the answer.
There's no distinction in terms of the actual
me
behavior.
hear
Gordon
that. Let me
Gordon
hear that.
Ramsay.
But what
will-
distinction could there possibly be made? It's part of the reality TV
Brand.
culture. Yeah, it's like a thing that's been going on for a while. Very rough characters who were entertaining because they can be a little abusive to people, have a certain amount of charm and a gift of gab, and that's what's produced. And there's always going to be a market for that. We have it in Canada with Don Cherry. I mean, look, a lot of people admire you because you're perceived as someone who's a franc-parleur, who says things that are, some people might not have the bravery to
straight
say.
shooter.
Okay, a straight shooter in English. So some people admire that and they like it, and other people view it as too coarse and unrefined. And I mean, it's I think where it becomes abusive is you talk about the scope or the responsibility of the person. What disturbs me about Trump, that doesn't disturb me about Gordon Ramsay, is that he is now going to be in the White House.
But can
That's
you
a
say? But can you say that someone like Gordon Ramsay and the
Enables.
Simon Cowells enables or sort of set the stage or normalize the frankly it was Trump's reality TV appearances and
yeah,
aggression on The Apprentice,
yeah.
that may have normalized and sort of made it not that big a deal, sort of desensitized us to this type of diatribe. Just made it not such a big deal. Like, oh, okay, well, he could still be president. It's fine. Whereas maybe 20 years ago, this would have been beyond our sensibilities.
I think that's a little glib. I think there are way too many factors, like in what got him
Yes.
elected, and what we be singing. We'd have a completely different discourse had Hillary Clinton just won a few more states. Had a few tens of thousands of people in certain districts voted differently, we would not be having this discussion in the same intensity about the coursing of the culture. And it seems that the fact that he's winning, we've highlighted this issue a bit too much, maybe?
Well, I think it was being highlighted over the course. That's not fair, because it was highlighted over the course of the election. Part of it is that he got even as far as he did, that he even got the nomination, was still just mind-blowing. And frankly, from my perspective, just watching the primaries to begin with, and watching who were the contenders.
Carly Fiorini.
Well, not just that. Watching the contenders on the Republican side was really, Trump was the.
In a paradoxical way, he was one of the less crazy contestants on that reality show.
Yeah, but that's, I think, part of the reaction that I've heard from people who are Trump supporters, that the perception is that the other people, the more professional politicians out there, are
disingenuous.
Are disingenuous. That they're narcissistic people who are power hungry, who have punched down in their careers, who have done what they've done to get into power. This is what reality is.
Well, then how about that? Then maybe how about that? And I think this comes full circle back to, if we believe as a society, that if we believe that this is normal, that this is okay. I think a lot of even the discussions about, Trump's pussy grabbing, people kept bringing back Bill Clinton and the accusations of sexual assault against him, which most people sort of reduced to, a torrid affair between he and Monica Lewinsky, but there were actual real, accusations against him of assault and of rape.
Pshaw.
There were accusations. Well, you can say pshaw, but the accusations existed.
We all speak for English here, right?
We do.
Yeah.
But anyways,
charges.
Yes, the charges.
Not that there were criminal charges. He was charged.
Anyways, but the fact is that these things, that the fact that these types of behaviors, that the more that we normalize and that we think it's that we just see and we see not punished, this type of aggressive punch down behavior, be it verbally aggressive, relationally aggressive, or physically aggressive, the more it just becomes, no big deal. And that's disturbing.
Let me end with this question, because obviously bullying is not going anywhere anytime soon, but what advice would you give to anyone out there, whether it's on social media or otherwise, who encounters bullying? What is the best, most effective way to respond to a bully?
A demand letter from a senior attorney in a firm that does civil responsibility. Threaten a lawsuit large enough, anybody will back down.
I agree.
I think one of the big things is to, it depends, of course, on the age and on the age of the target and of the social situation of the target, but of the bullying. But I think a lot of it becomes, try to disengage as much as possible from the bullying, try to ignore it as best as you possibly can, act as though it's not existing, while simultaneously trying to seek help from people that are in higher power than you, in higher power positions.
Let's end with, as we do with further reading, any articles, any pieces, any even video or audio that you would recommend people check out on this subject.
I would recommend people go to stopbullying.gov. That gives an extensive range of information about bullying, including statistics, including laws that are in effect, the link between bullying and suicide, that talks about groups that tend to be targeted, like in the LGBTQ community. And I think that's a tremendous place to start. So really rich information.
For further investigation and research reading, what I alluded to earlier, this Zimbardo's latest project, the Heroic Imagination Project. I like it because it has like a positive psychology spin. It's about modeling heroic behavior for the next generation, for young people, rather than hand-wringing about victimization. I find it's a nice approach. So, Heroic Imagination Project, Philip Zimbardo.
I would suggest if you really want to find out a lot of the more empirically validated, the evidence-based approaches for bullying and how to deal with it, I would look up anything by Olweus, Olweus, because he's really been one of the leaders in the field. And then to touch on something that's a little, it's close to my heart, is how bullying kind of intersects with children on the autism spectrum, and how in effect, due to their social communication difficulties, they often end up being, for lack of a better word, the perfect targets. And there is actually a book called Perfect Targets that speaks directly to this, and a fantastic book called Freaks, Geeks, and Asperger Syndrome, which is by Luke Jackson, who was a 13-year-old boy with who was diagnosed with Asperger syndrome, who wrote the book, which is really just a fantastic book and maybe really helpful for parents to read with their kids who are on the spectrum.
Excellent. Join us next time for another episode of the Goldwaters from the kitchen. You can join the conversation on Facebook or Twitter at #TheGoldwaters. I'm Dan Delmar, your moderator, and thank you, Goldwaters.
Thanks, Dan.
Thanks, Dan.
Okay.
If I don't have a piece of that apple cake, I swear to fuck, I'm gonna kill someone.
Provocateur.media